Oh, well, good afternoon. As announced, consideration this afternoon is the amazing history and future of the Jews. And I suppose the first question that we might be asking is, well, why is it amazing? And when we stop to consider the history of the Jews, we do find it is absolutely incredible. As we said there, the history of the Jews is amazing because it is unique. There's no other nation that has a history like the Jews, for the reasons we'll demonstrate. But why is it unique? It's unique because the complete history of the Jews was revealed in amazing detail before it happened. And that's the important point we're making. The complete history of the Jews was revealed before it happened. Every other nation has only been able to record its history after the events have happened. So that makes it quite unique amongst all the nations of the world. Well, what do we have to say about declaring the future? If we turn to Isaiah chapter 41, we will put the passages on the screen, but you're very welcome to turn them up. In Isaiah chapter 41, the prophet Isaiah is brought before the people, Jew and Gentile, and he says this: "Produce your cause, saith the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. Let them bring them forth, and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things what they be, that we may consider them, and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that ye are gods." So there's the challenge. God says, I'm in control, but if you think that you are a God, well, let's have a look at the evidence. Can you tell us can you explain the past? Can you tell us what's going to happen in the future? This is not some crystal ball gazing. This is actually a complete record of future, what will become history. Show the things that are to come hereafter. And again, in Isaiah 43 and verses 10 and 12, God says of the Jews, "Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me." And we've got a very brief summary there, that the history of the nation of Israel was foretold accurately many years before the events began, proving the existence of God and his control. So there we've just got that summary statement. The history of the nation of Israel was foretold accurately many years before the events began, proving the existence of God and his control. So then, what we're looking at is the evidence that the complete history of the Jews was provided. You may wish to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 28, but we will actually come to these in slightly more detail. This is merely a summary of what we can find in this amazing chapter. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses is speaking to the nation of Israel just as they were about to go in to inherit the territory of Palestine or Canaan, whichever title we like to use it. Now, the important thing to consider is that the history of the Jews that is described there starts roughly BC 1,600 years before Christ, and it completes up to AD 1945, a period of roughly 3,500 years, all written, 3,500 years of history before it even began. And Deuteronomy 28 was written around about 1,600 years before Christ. So what do we find? Well, in verses 25 to 36, it talks about the conquest by Babylon, conquest of the Jews by Nebuchadnezzar and his armies. Verses 37 to 45 describes the captivity that the Jews experienced under the Gentiles. Verse 46 and 47 describes the curses that were going to be brought on Israel for their disobedience as a sign and a wonder, the evidence of God's hand at work. In verses 48 to 52, it describes the Roman oppression when the Romans took control of the Jews. And ultimately, it led to, as verse 53 to 57 describes, the horrific siege of Jerusalem, which in its gravity probably has exceeded all other similar sieges. And finally, verses 58 to 64, not finally, next to finally, describes the scattering of the Jews worldwide in what became the diaspora. We've described it there, verses 65 to 68, the distress in diaspora. But we say this covers a considerable period of time, roughly 1600 years before Christ. It commences and finishes all the modern day. So that's what we want to demonstrate is contained in the Bible as the history of the Jews before it came to pass. So just going into these in a little bit of detail, God spoke to Israel through Moses, and he said, you're going into this land, and it depends whether you are obedient to my commands or whether you disobey as to what the future holds. And he says in verse 1 of Deuteronomy 28, it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. So our starting point is when Israel became a nation and were given possession of a national homeland, but under conditions set by God. What happened in the future would depend on their response to the commandments which he set before them. However, as the 28th chapter describes in verses 15 and 25, just picking those two verses as a summary, it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, the Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. So this was going to be the consequence of them disregarding the commandments of the Lord, that he would cause them to be smitten before their enemies. And sadly, Israel did not hearken to God, and the rest of the chapter foretold what was to become their history. It hadn't happened, it was to become their history over the centuries that followed. So the first section that we want to just briefly mention, still in Deuteronomy chapter 28, it's covered in verses 15 to 24. And we're going to take an example of the content of those verses rather than read all the verses. It's a long chapter. So verse 20, we read, the Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke in all that thou settest thine hand unto for to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me. So that would be the tragic consequences of Israel disregarding the commandments of God, that God would subject them to oppression until they were destroyed off the land, because they had forsaken him. Again, moving on to the next section, Deuteronomy 28, verses 25 to 35. We'll pick out two verses as an example of what's in those 11 verses. Verses 25 and 26, where we read, the Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies, thou shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth, and thy carcass shall be meat unto all fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth. Figurative description of the nations that were around. And where the nation of Israel was divided into 12 tribes, the first 10 of which eventually were conquered by the Assyrian army. As we've put there, the Assyrian army conquered 10 tribes of Israel and dispersed them among the nations to avoid the possibility of rebellion. They dispersed them, scattered them all over the place, so they couldn't unite together against the Assyrians on a future occasion. And that's what God said would happen, and it came to pass. So far as the other two sections of the nation of Israel are concerned, there's something particular for them. And in verse 36, we read, the Lord shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there shalt thou serve other gods, wood and stone. The interesting thing is, at this time when they stood on the borders of the promised land, they didn't have a king. Israel was ruled over by judges, but it was already anticipated by God in his plan that at some stage in the future they would demand a king like the nations, and they would be provided with a king that would rule over them. So we notice we've emphasized the wording, the Lord shall bring thee and thy king. They ain't got a king when Moses spoke these things to them, but God insisted, shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And this was a future recognition that Israel will become a kingdom like the nations around them. The last king over Israel, the last that has existed over that kingdom from that day to this, was Zedekiah, the king of Judah, who was captured by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar and his armies, and carried captive to Babylon along with his people. So it predicted the Babylonian rule, and here again it came to pass. The Babylonian rule was followed by the Persians and the Greeks ruling over God's people. And again we have the verses that follow describe their experiences in that time, verses 37 to 47. And we'll pick two verses just to illustrate the general ideas. There we read, thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb and a byword among all nations, where the Lord shall lead thee. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. They might raise families, but it was only like a feeder for the Babylonians, the Persians and the Greeks, that they would rule over their children. They would gain no joy or benefit from their own family. That's interesting. Thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. Well, there's so many proverbs and bywords about the Jew, exclusive to that people. We've heard people have been Jewed, and the anti-Semitic experiences of the Jews themselves demonstrates how uniquely this oppression has come upon the Jewish people, even where they've been scattered amongst all nations. So despite being repatriated after 70 years in Babylon, Judah never stopped being oppressed by the Persians and the Greeks. And next stop was the Romans. So moving on to the Roman oppression of the Jews, in Deuteronomy 28, verses 48 to 52. And again, we'll pick two representative verses, verses 49 and 52, where we read, the Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle fly, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. The eagle was the emblem of the Roman armies that invaded most of the known world at that time. And that's a reference here, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. And he shall be seized in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest, throughout all thy land. And he shall be seized in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. Now that was going to be a terrible time under the Roman domination. And the New Testament of the Bible describes much of the experiences in the time of Roman oppression. But it came to an inglorious end with the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, where the city of Jerusalem and the temple were ransacked and destroyed. And this is the graphic description that was exclusive to that time, the siege of Jerusalem, verses 56 and 57. The tender and delicate woman, her eyes shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, excuse me, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear. For she shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness, wherewith thine enemy shall distress thee in thy gates. What a horrible thing. In fact, it was so repulsive that when the Roman soldiers discovered these half-eaten children where their mothers were so desperate, they were physically sick and couldn't continue. And the historian Josephus, in the book that he wrote of the times, confirmed this is exactly what happened in the siege of Jerusalem. Well, what followed was that the nation of Israel was scattered. And Deuteronomy 28 describes the scattering in verses 58 to 64. An example, verse 64. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Well, we can only look at books on the history of the Jews, and much is written with regard to what is described as the Jewish diaspora, the dispersal of the Jews amongst all nations of the earth. And remarkably, they've survived, and their identity is still intact. No other nation has suffered so much and still exists today. A unique feature of this time was Zion plowed as a field. The prophecy of Micah in the 3rd chapter describes the event. In Micah chapter 3, and reading from verse 12. The prophet wrote, Therefore shall Zion for your sake be ploughed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of the forest. Zion was the city of David. It was the place where the worship of the Jews was concentrated. And so to ensure that they were shamefully exposed, the Roman armies did the following. As Gibbon wrote in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, after the final destruction of the temple by the arms of Titus and Hadrian, a ploughshare was drawn over the consecrated ground as a sign of perpetual interdiction. Zion was deserted. Well, that might seem a very small detail, but who would record, who would even go as far as to do this, just to drag a plough over the capital city of a nation as a sign of destruction? But this was recorded in the prophetic writings of Micah, and it came to pass, as Gibbon explained in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then bringing us more or less up to the modern times, the Second World War, amongst many other persecutions, the Holocaust sticks out amongst them all, with 6 million Jews perishing in the gas chambers and elsewhere at the hands of the Nazis. And so in verses 65 to 67, as typical of the verses here, among these nations thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, Would God it were morning, for the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. Very graphic description of the atrocities of the time. We were very familiar with, some here would remember, Ted Rousel. He just managed to escape the Nazi persecutions, but emphasised the fact that these words were fulfilled exactly. That in the morning they said, Would God it were even. In the evening they said, Would God it were morning. Because all that they faced was terror at the hands of the search squads and Kristallnacht, where everything was smashed up that belonged to the Jews. So moving on then to the recent history of the Jews, that covers quite a very long period of time. But not only did Deuteronomy contain a prophecy that was very precise about these times, but there are other prophecies in the scriptures which demonstrate that God was in control of events, as he had promised in Deuteronomy 28. So, looking at one or two things, a kingdom lost, because the kingdom perished, with Zedekiah, the last wicked prince of Israel, in whose days God said, I will overturn it. And in Ezekiel 21, this is what God said at that time, about 600 years before Christ. He said, I will overturn it, and it shall be no more, until he come, whose right it is, and I will give it him. So God said the kingdom was finished. finished for centuries, but a message of hope that there was going to be one provided by God, whose right it is. And God said, I will give this kingdom, restore it, and give it to him. In Jeremiah chapter 30, the prophet Jeremiah was sent to Israel with good news of this time when he whose right it is would come. He said, I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. If we could project ourselves back 200 years, you might look at the situation in the Middle East and think, how's that going to ever be possible that the Jews will return? Well, there they are today, a thriving nation of Israel established, and a prosperous nation too. Yes, God said, I'll bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah. That was written probably 600 years before Christ, and now it's come to pass in our lifetimes. So it's an amazing sign of the times that God's purpose is being worked out. And so Jesus spoke about the end of this desolation, a long period of time, but he spoke about the end of this devastation or desolation in Luke 21, speaking to his disciples. Just picking out the crucial piece from these verses, Jesus said, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So Jesus said that there'll be a long period of devastation. The Jews will be suffered, they'll be persecuted, they'll be scattered. And Jerusalem itself, the city that was the city of the great king, will be downtrodden of the Gentiles, but with a limit on the duration of that oppression by the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. If we went back 150 years, we find that Palestine was under Turkish control. The land was neglected and desolate. Despite what we see today, it was neglected and desolate, and there were very few Jews or Arabs in the land at all. What we'd like to do is just to demonstrate how Bible prophecy can be interpreted, and then events can be seen to be accomplished in accordance with what is a realistic interpretation of prophecy. We're going to take the Bible, its author is God, and we might say it was completed with the book of Revelation in AD 96. We want to take another book. We don't put any particular store by the author of that book, not inspired, but a man who expressed an understanding of the Bible. And so we describe him as a Bible reader. And that work was completed in AD 1848, so a considerable time ago. We'd like to just see some of the things that were written, but not because he was clever, but because he understood the Bible, and it demonstrated how the Bible did foretell these things, and they came to pass. In Jeremiah 30, and verse 3, we can read, For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it, which is what we just read. Then in Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah wrote in the 12th chapter, the Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first. So a section of the nation of Israel was to be repatriated first, for reasons which the scriptures describe. The prophet Ezekiel in chapter 36 said, God said through him, I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it, and the cities shall be inhabited and the wastes shall be builded. And remember that the comments we're just about to read were an interpretation of those passages of scripture made in 1848, when there wasn't a single Jew in the land. Well, probably that's an exaggeration, there might have been odd ones, but there certainly was no civilization of Jew or Arab in the land at that time. It was under Turkish control. But in Elpis Israel, the author wrote, there is then a partial and primary restoration of Jews before the manifestation, as he described it before Jesus returns. So it's to happen in sections, a small section first, to be followed by a complete restoration of the Jews, people of Israel, to the land. We notice there, next to the last paragraph we've highlighted, God said, the waste shall be builded. Waste, that's an interesting expression, because if we look at what the Bible has to say about the waste being builded, we read there the prophecy of Ezekiel. He said, the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people, the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Have been always waste. Mark Twain, the author, Samuel Clemens, his real name, took a tour of Palestine in 1867, and describing what he saw in Palestine, he wrote, a desolate country whose soil is rich enough but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route. Sorry, we lost that. Yeah, I'll look again. Yeah, Mark Twain passed those comments, which hopefully will come back up on the screen in a minute. Anyway, while that's just coming back up, they've always been made waste. But he wrote, we can get through this, so. A desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds. A silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There's hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, were absent. So, what about the waste being built? That was Mark Twain writing before anything happened. But here we've got a picture. First of all, the quote, the land that is brought back from the sword is gathered out of many people. In Tel Aviv, as an example, celebrations, centenary celebrations, mark the difference between 1909 and 2009. For what existed of Tel Aviv in 2009, you can see that group of people who were just there looking to see what the land was like. A waste desert, that's all they found. And the picture on the right is the same location, Tel Aviv in 2009. This waste and desolate land was now a flourishing city in fulfillment of what the Bible, or God through the Bible, had to say. So coming back to God's promise, what did the Bible have to say further? Well, he said, but ye, O mountains of Israel, shall shoot forth your full fruit to my people of Israel, for they are at hand to come. For behold, I am for you, and I will turn unto you, and ye shall be tilled and sown. And I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it. And the cities shall be inhabited, and the wastes shall be builded. Ezekiel chapter 36. And what did the author write in Elpis Israel? Before these events took place, because of an understanding of what God had promised. He said the pre-adventual colonization of Palestine will be on purely political principles, and the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the Messiahship of Christ, of Jesus. They will emigrate thither as agriculturists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth. That was written in 1848. The important thing is that they weren't going back as a religious people. They were going back for political reasons only, which is an interesting aspect, which is very clearly the case if we consider the things that took place. And we're going to illustrate the remarkable events which brought about the fulfillment of these promises that God made. On political principles only, this is where it's all started, around about the 1900s. First of all, there's a trial in France. I'm not sure it's Paris now, but there's a trial of Captain Dreyfus, who was court-martialed and jailed for treason. But you can see the newspaper cuttings, J'accuse. A letter was sent to the President of the Republic of France, protesting about the treatment of Captain Dreyfus. They said it was a put-up show because he was a Jew. And in fact, he was retried and he was exonerated. The accusations were not substantiated, but it led to some dramatic changes that took place in the world. Again, on political principles only. This man, Theodore Herzl, was reporting the trial of Captain Dreyfus. He was so appalled at the hatred of the Jews exhibited at the trial that he founded the Zionist movement to seek a home for the Jews. They were down with the Jews, and he was so overwhelmed that he started this movement of the Zionist movement for the home for the Jews. In the book we're talking about, the restoration of the Jews is a work of time and will require between 50 and 60 years to accomplish. And Theodore Herzl said that Bali founded the Jewish state. So it might take 5 years, it might take 50 years, and people might laugh at the idea that the Jewish state could ever be re-established. They might laugh, but he said these things will take no more than 50 years to accomplish. Well, in 1897, he wrote that. That was when the first Zionist Congress was established. 51 years later, in 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Well, that was Theodore Herzl saying, might take 50 years, but somewhere between 5 and 50. The writer of Elpis Israel said, restoration of the Jews is a work of time, will require between 50 and 60 years to accomplish. That was an understanding of scripture on his part. Theodore Herzl wasn't a scripture-minded man, but he predicted the same as a consequence of the work that he was undertaking. So how was this to be brought about? Again, on political principles. He wrote, this is the author of Elpis Israel, I know not whether the men who at present contrive the foreign policy of Britain entertain the idea of assuming the sovereignty of the Holy Land and of promoting its colonization by the Jews. Their present intentions, however, are of no importance, one way or another, because they will be compelled by events soon to happen to do what under exist, for heaven and earth will not move them to accomplish. This was going to be something which was defied all logic on their part. They would be forced to take the next steps. And what were those next steps? Well, this man, Chaim Weizmann, a Russian-born chemist, came to the aid of the British in the 14-18 First World War. The supplies of nitrates necessary for depth charges and other explosives was stopped because the German U-boats prevented the shipping of such components. But Weizmann came up with a substitute which saved the British and saved a lot of lives and probably altered the course of the First World War. And so he was part of the Zionist movement, and he appealed to the government to say, well, I've done this for you. What about you doing something for me? And the famous Balfour Declaration was then produced, which said that Her Majesty's government viewed with favour the establishment of in Palestine of a home for the Jews. And that was 1917. That's a facsimile of the original letter from Lord Balfour saying that that's exactly what the British government had said they were prepared to support. So Britain was to take a role, something which heaven and earth combined together under natural circumstances would never have moved the British government to follow through. But because of the debt of gratitude to Weizmann, they took on board this responsibility, just as the scriptures required. Talks in Isaiah about a land shadowing with wings. In Isaiah we read, "Ho to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, that sendeth ambassadors by sea, saying, Go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled, a nation meted out and trodden down. See ye, when he lifteth up an ensign on the mountains. Yeah, a country beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. You can see the rivers of Ethiopia, the Euphrates and the Tigris there in the Middle East. They're just depicted inside the blue ring. And the fact that it says sendeth ambassadors by the sea is an indication that this power is an island power, because its only means of communication with the nations was by sea, a unique situation in which Britain fulfilled that role. Britain, with its overspreading wings from the UK to India, with the Middle East at its heart, was that power. As the writer of Elpis Israel said, to Britain, then, the prophet calls us the protector of the Jewish nation in the evening tide trouble, and commands it to send its messengers in swift vessels to bring about this repatriation. Well, despite all that goes off in the Middle East with the PLO and the other Palestinian representatives claiming what is their land, this was the land that was designated by international agreement to be the land of Israel. You can see it's surrounded by the red line. Goes all the way around there. That's the River Jordan. But that's the land as it was first designated. Palestinian mandate granted to Britain at the San Remo conference in 1920 defined the Jewish national home as being that within the red boundary there. But as is indicated on the map, separated from Palestine by Britain is that area in the green. It was given to Emir Abdullah and named Transjordan and was close to Jewish settlements. So that was something agreed eventually by the British, that all of the area in the green would be Transjordan, and this would be the area that would be designated for Israel. So that was agreed by international meeting, and it's just lost sight of in the present situation, as if it's never happened. But Britain was given the responsibility to bring that about, as was indicated there. Well, Israel was reborn, despite all the trials, all the centuries of dispersion. On the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion announced the State of Israel was born. There's the Palestine Post. State of Israel is born. And as the Bible says, see when he lifted up an ensign upon the mountains, there's other implications as well. But that certainly was the raising of an ensign on the mountains of Israel to say, we are home. The next step in the purpose of God, as prophecy required it, was the end of the desolation of Jerusalem. Well, it was recovered by a remarkable set of circumstances in the June 67 war, the Six-Day War, as it was often referred to. Jesus said, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. This famous photograph of the Jewish soldiers at the wall in Jerusalem is an indication of how strongly they felt with regard to the fact that they recaptured Jerusalem and it was liberated for them. Emotional Israeli soldiers overcome by the recapture of their ancient capital of Jerusalem during the Six-Day War of June 1967. It was foretold in AD 32 that Jesus said, the quote at the top, and it became history in AD 1967 in our lifetime. Well, what of the future of the Jews? Much could be written, and we haven't really got the time to go into a lot of detail with what is written, foretold there, but just an indication of the events which are happening now and project into the future. The climax revealed in Zechariah 14, not a happy one, but a happy ending. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Well, we can see that's boiling up to that end. Certainly it said that Jerusalem will be made a burdensome stone for all nations, and it certainly has become that over the last few years. But this is the climax of God's purpose thus far. And reading verse 3, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. In chapter 14, verse 9, the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one. Jesus was crucified by the Jews, leading up to the punishment in AD 70. But God has said, and Jesus repeated what was said in Ezekiel's time, I will overturn it, and it shall be no more, until he come whose right it is, and I will give it him. The Acts of the Apostles tells us who is that one, that God will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath chosen, whereof he hath given assurance, and that he hath raised him from the dead. The Lord Jesus Christ is the future King of Israel, who will be established on the throne of his father David in Zion, Mount Zion or Jerusalem. And in that day the Lord shall be king over all the earth. There are many prophecies that describe the process by which the nations will be brought into subjection. And as God promised, Israel will become the head of the nations, never again the tail, as it is now. So, the final end of war. This is the prospect when Jesus is established on the throne of Israel as King of the Jews. The prophet Isaiah was sent to speak of these good things and wrote of them in the second chapter in another remarkable prophecy, which is only either being fulfilled, we believe. Isaiah 2 verse 3, many people shall go and say, come ye, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the Lord, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And verse 4, he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. And the prophet speaks of a remarkable situation where 10 men out of the nations will take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. What a wonderful change that will be. The Jew, never more despised in the time to come, will become the people of God. And the future of the world is dependent on that happening. But just to summarize the amazing prophecies, we said at the beginning, the history of the Jews in Deuteronomy 28 was from 1600, plus other prophecies bring us to 1967, the June War. Firstly, Israel's theocracy became a kingdom in BC 1000, just as predicted. The Babylonians would conquer the Jews in BC 612 or thereabouts, again as predicted in Deuteronomy 28. Jerusalem would be subject to a horrific siege, AD 70, just as predicted in Deuteronomy 28. The Jews would be scattered worldwide in the same prophecy. Jerusalem would be ploughed as a field, as the prophet Micah said, fulfilled after the destruction of AD 70. The Jews would be regathered to their land, as Jeremiah and others said, 1900 onwards. Israel would become a nation again, 1948, the state of Israel declared. And finally, Jerusalem would be restored to the Jews, and it happened in 1967. What a remarkable set of prophecies. This was the history of Israel as it was declared to be in BC 1600, and the history books demonstrate that everything has come to pass that was predicted in those prophecies. Well, thank you for your attention. Whilst it's been quite comprehensive, I hope that at least it stirs some interest in what the Bible had to say and has been fulfilled. Thank you.